I found out my husband was dead from a neighbor. Not from a doctor's somber phone call, not from the measured tones of a police officer at the door, and certainly not from the sterile efficiency of a hospital administrator. No, the news arrived unceremoniously, bundled with gossip and groceries, delivered by Martha Hayes, the woman next door whose lawn sprinklers always seemed to douse my morning paper. She saw the ambulance drive off from the post office downtown, saw the still form on the stretcher, heard the whispers, and apparently thought I, Claire Abbott, his wife of 47 years, should know. "George collapsed at the post office, dear," she said, clutching a brown paper bag overflowing with leafy greens. Her voice pitched with that peculiar blend of morbid curiosity and feigned sympathy neighbors reserve for unfolding tragedies. "Massive stroke, they're saying. Happened right there by the counter. They say he didn't make it." She reported his death like the weather had unexpectedly changed, a sudden, inconvenient downpour on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. I stood there on my own front porch, clad only in my worn slippers and faded housecoat, the morning chill biting at my bare ankles. I watched her turn and walk back across the neatly manicured lawn, separating our houses, the silence she left behind slowly hardening around me, solidifying into something heavy, permanent, and utterly terrifying. That was the first, jarring moment I realized George, my meticulous, always prepared George, had left me completely, utterly unprepared for this. We'd been married for 47 years, a lifetime. I'd stopped working my secretarial job when I was 30, when our children, Emily and later, Ben, were small and demanding. He'd insisted, his voice firm but kind. "You don't need to bother with that anymore, Claire," he'd promised, taking my hands in his strong, capable ones. "I'll take care of everything, always." And fool that I was, I let him. Not because I was lazy or inherently helpless, not because I lacked ambition or capability, but because I believed him. Because I loved him. Because I believed implicitly, unquestioningly, in us. In the sturdy, reliable partnership we had built. For a few disorienting days after Martha's pronouncement, everything blurred into a gray, tear-soaked fog. Endless phone calls from well-meaning but ultimately useless relatives. Condolences offered in hushed, awkward tones. Bouquets of funereal flowers arriving from people I hadn't seen or spoken to in 20 years, their cloying scent filling the house, mingling sickeningly with the lingering aroma of George's pipe tobacco. The funeral itself was a brief, expensive, and strangely cold affair, orchestrated with brisk efficiency by our son, Ben, who seemed more focused on the logistics than the loss. Our daughter, Emily, flew in from California, arriving late and looking perpetually distracted. She cried dramatically for half the service, her sobs echoing theatrically in the hushed chapel, and spent the other half scrolling intently through her phone, her thumb moving in relentless, tiny arcs across the screen. I tried to forgive her detachment, told myself everyone grieves differently. Some withdraw, some perform. It wasn't until the house finally emptied out a week later. The last casserole dish returned, the final sympathy card acknowledged, that the silence truly descended, and I began to notice the subtle, ominous cracks appearing in the foundation of the life George had supposedly built to protect me. First, there were the polite but persistent phone calls from the bank. A man named Mr. Harrison, his voice smooth and professional, left messages asking to speak with someone regarding the settlement of some overdue items connected to Mr. Abbott's estate. I initially assumed it was just routine bills, perhaps a minor oversight in the transition, a simple mistake easily rectified. Then came the stark, undeniable reality of a bounced check, the one I'd written to the lawn care service, drawn on our joint checking account, the same account George had used meticulously for decades to pay everything, from the mortgage and utilities to the newspaper delivery and the kid who mowed the lawn in the summer. Humiliated and confused, I logged into the online banking portal, something I hadn't done in years. George always handled it, using the password he'd finally, reluctantly, shared with me a few months prior after a minor health scare. My stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot as the balance loaded onto the screen. Less than $300 remained. $287.14, to be precise. I sat there at the familiar worn kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, staring numbly at the stark, impossible number glowing on the laptop screen. The kettle began to whistle its cheerful, insistent tune on the stove behind me, a sound suddenly grating, obscene in its normalcy. George, my dependable, meticulous George, always handled the finances, the taxes, the insurance policies, the retirement accounts, the investments he vaguely mentioned making, all of it. He kept everything neatly organized in the old metal filing cabinet in the hallway closet, but the details, the passwords, the account numbers, the actual balances, those he kept to himself. I had trusted him implicitly. I had never even had the online banking login until that recent health scare prompted me to insist. "It's just one less thing for you to worry your pretty little head about, Claire." He'd always say dismissively, patting my hand whenever I'd tentatively inquired about our financial health over the years. A phrase I'd once found endearing. Protective, now felt chillingly patronizing, deliberately obfuscating. It turns out I should have worried. A lot. The bank, when I called, wouldn't discuss the specifics over the phone, citing privacy regulations and the complexities of estate settlement. "You'll need to come in person, Mrs. Abbott." Mr. Harrison's smooth voice informed me politely but firmly. "Please bring photo identification, Mr. Abbott's death certificate, and any relevant documents you might have regarding his estate." Estate. The word echoed hollowly in my ears. I let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. What estate? An empty checking account and a pile of overdue bills? I didn't sleep that night. Sleep felt like a luxury I could no longer afford, a betrayal of the vigilance I should have practiced years ago. I sat huddled in George's old, worn leather recliner in the den, a thick wool blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders despite the mild autumn air, watching the digital clock on the cable box flicker past the endless, silent hours. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. My mind raced, replaying 47 years of marriage, searching desperately for clues I must have missed, signs of trouble I had ignored, moments where trust had blindly overridden caution. Around 3 a.m., propelled by a sudden, desperate surge of energy, I found myself in front of the old metal filing cabinet in the hallway closet. It was George's domain, meticulously organized, filled with manila folders bearing his neat, precise labels: house, mortgage, deed, insurance, home, auto, taxes, federal, state. Funeral arrangements. The last one, tucked ominously in the back, made me wince. George, ever the planner, had indeed prepared for his own demise, prepaying for the plot, the casket, the service. He'd meticulously planned ahead for his death. I'll give him that. And yet, the will. If there even was a will detailing the distribution of assets, it wasn't here. Not in the folder marked legal, not anywhere obvious. I sifted through every document, my fingers growing numb, my heart sinking lower with each empty folder. I found a dusty, thicker manila envelope labeled simply Living Trust, 2011, containing complex-looking legal documents I couldn't begin to decipher. I found a few old life insurance statements, dating back years, none recent, none clearly indicating a current policy or beneficiary, nothing updated. Nothing with my name prominently featured as the recipient of anything substantial. No clear instructions, no designated beneficiaries beyond vague references in the outdated trust document. Just old copies, legal jargon, and, chillingly, a small yellow sticky note adhered precariously to one of the old insurance statements. It bore only 2 words, scrawled in George's familiar hand: "Talk to Valerie." Who the hell was Valerie? The name meant nothing to me. The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care, choosing my best navy sweater, tailored gray slacks, and comfortable but polished low-heeled flats. Armor. I might have been reeling internally, terrified of what I was about to uncover, but I refused to look like a victim. I was too old to look elegant, perhaps, but certainly not too old to look capable, composed, in control. I gathered the binder containing the few documents I possessed: the death certificate, my ID, the outdated trust papers, the cryptic sticky note, took a deep, steadying breath, and drove myself back to the imposing edifice of First National Bank on Fairview Avenue. Mr. Harrison, the polite young man with the smooth voice and the prematurely weary eyes, ushered me into his small, sterile office. He had the kind of quiet, understated demeanor you sometimes find in people who attended expensive private schools and have spent 2 decades navigating the gentle, soul-crushing disappointments of corporate life. He looked me over politely, his gaze perhaps registering the subtle signs of my sleepless night, the faint tremor in my hands I couldn't quite conceal. He pulled up our records on his computer screen. "Mrs. Abbott," he began, his tone professionally somber, "again, please accept my deepest condolences on your loss." I nodded curtly, unwilling to engage in pleasantries. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Let's talk about the accounts." He clicked and scrolled through several screens, his expression growing increasingly troubled. He paused, sighed almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Well, Mrs. Abbott, as we discussed briefly yesterday, there are a few complications regarding Mr. Abbott's financial arrangements." "Complications such as?" I prompted, keeping my voice level. "Well," he began hesitantly, "there's the matter of the primary joint checking account, which, as you know, is nearly depleted. Considerably overdrawn. In fact, once pending debits are factored in." He cleared his throat. "But there was also a second significant account here at First National. An investment account, not held in joint names. It was solely under Mr. Abbott's name and Social Security number." My mouth went instantly dry. "A second account? A sole account? I didn't know about any second account," I stammered, feeling a fresh wave of cold shock wash over me. Mr. Harrison looked genuinely surprised, his professional mask slipping for a moment. "You didn't?" "Ma'am, the account has been active, highly active, for at least the past 12 years. Substantial funds." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He turned the large monitor slightly towards me, angling it so I could see the screen clearly. The numbers displayed there made my throat close, my vision swim. It wasn't just substantial, it was staggering. The current balance showed just over $240,000. The transaction history revealed regular, large deposits, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, at a time, originating from sources I didn't recognize. And equally regular, significant withdrawals occurring every few months. Most of these withdrawals, disturbingly, were labeled simply VLS Services. What is VLS Services?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Harrison hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, due to privacy regulations, I'm not permitted to disclose specific details about third-party transactions without proper authorization. However," he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, "the payment codes suggest it's likely a vendor, perhaps a consulting group, or possibly a personal service arrangement. Does the name VLS Services, or perhaps the initials, mean anything to you?" I shook my head numbly. "VLS? Valerie? Could it be?" I didn't recognize the acronym. I didn't recognize any of it. And I certainly didn't recognize the woman's name listed prominently on the account details screen as an authorized user with full transactional privileges, Valerie L. Scott. Not my daughter, Emily, who lived halfway across the country and barely managed her own finances. Not a relative I knew, not anyone I had ever heard George mention in 47 years of marriage. "She's listed here, Mr." Harrison continued, pointing to the screen, his voice regaining its professional neutrality, "as a financial proxy, designated by Mr. Abbott, with full access to the account funds." My fingers felt cold, numb. When was she added? As a proxy? He scrolled back through the account history. According to our records, 7 years ago, March 2018. I stood up slowly then, my legs trembling beneath me, needing to escape the sterile confines of the office, the suffocating weight of these revelations. Is Is that legal? I asked, the question sounding naive, foolish, even to my own ears. To give a stranger full access to our money? Mr. Harrison blinked, looking flustered. Well, Mrs. Abbott, that depends entirely on the circumstances. If Miss Scott held a valid power of attorney document signed by Mr. Abbott— She didn't, I interrupted firmly, though a sliver of doubt remained. George handled all the legal paperwork. Could he have? At least, not one that I was ever aware of. But the terrible truth was, standing there in that cold bank office, I realized I didn't truly know. I didn't know anything about the financial life my husband had been living, secretly, parallel to mine, for over a decade. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets seemed alien, distorted. I stared blankly at the road ahead, but my mind was elsewhere entirely, trapped in a chaotic whirlwind of questions and sickening possibilities. 12 years. 12 years of a secret account. 12 years of substantial, unexplained deposits. Another woman's name, Valerie L. Scott, inexplicably linked to our finances. Withdrawals coded as VLS services. A financial proxy granted 7 years ago. What did it all mean? Who was Valerie Scott? And what services had George been paying for, month after month, year after year, with money I never knew we had? I parked the car in our driveway, my driveway now, I supposed, a hollow victory, and sat for a long time with the engine off, just staring numbly at the closed garage door. George had built those sturdy wooden shelves inside himself years ago, meticulously organizing his tools, his paints, his supplies. Said it made him feel useful, grounded, to work with his hands after long days, crunching numbers, or so I thought. I remember how proud he looked the day he finally installed the automatic garage door opener, demonstrating it for me 6 times, like a boy with a new toy. I remember thinking then, with a surge of quiet affection, I don't need fancy flowers or expensive jewelry, just this. Just a good, steady man who comes home every night, who fixes things, who takes care of us. I hadn't known then that I'd married a man who, apparently, lived 2 entirely separate lives. A man capable of maintaining meticulous order in one, while weaving a complex web of secrecy and financial deception in the other. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive than before. I poured myself a glass of cold tea, the untouched cup from the morning still sitting accusingly on the counter, and went straight for the filing cabinet again. This time, I didn't just browse. I pulled every single folder out, dumping the contents onto the large kitchen table, creating a chaotic landscape of paper that mirrored the turmoil in my mind. Mortgage documents paid off, thank God. Old insurance policies, mostly expired, seemingly worthless. Decades of medical records, Social Security statements, birthday cards from the kids, saved for sentimental reasons. Tax returns, meticulously filed year after year, all bearing George's neat, precise handwriting. He was nothing if not organized, compulsively so. But there was no mention anywhere of Valerie L. Scott. No contracts with VLS services, no correspondence, no receipts, no invoices that shed any light on this hidden financial life. It was as if she, and the substantial sums flowing towards her, existed in a completely separate universe, one that never intersected with the mundane reality documented in our shared files. It wasn't until I reached the bottom drawer, the one filled with miscellaneous warranties and appliance manuals I hadn't looked at in years, that I noticed it. A small, surprisingly heavy, fireproof safe, tucked away in the back corner, almost hidden from view. I had completely forgotten we even owned one. George must have bought it years ago, perhaps after a minor burglary scare in the neighborhood. The key, ridiculously, was still taped securely to the back, exactly where George, in a moment of misplaced confidence in his own cleverness, had hidden it decades ago, assuring me it was the last place anyone would ever look. It took me 3 tries, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, to get the small, slightly rusty lock to turn. The heavy lid creaked open. Inside were only 2 items. A beautiful silver pocket watch on a tarnished chain, the one that had belonged to his father, George's most prized possession. And nestled beside it, a thin, plain manila envelope with no label, no markings at all. My heart pounded as I opened it carefully. Inside was not a confession, not a hidden will, but something almost as damning, a series of folded printouts. Account statements from the very same hidden investment account Mr. Harrison had shown me at the bank, but these were much older, stretching back over a decade. The earliest was dated June 2011. The first deposit, $6,000, and then, month after month, without fail, another deposit, sometimes more, regular as a heartbeat. And interspersed between the deposits, those same cryptic withdrawals, VLS services, thousands of dollars flowing out, consistently, mysteriously. Tucked within the statements were also two official-looking receipts, printed on heavy bond paper, made out to a Valerie Scott Consulting Incorporated. No physical address was listed, just a P.O. box in downtown Portland and a phone number. The receipts were dated within the last year, each for professional administrative support services rendered, totaling nearly $30,000 in just 12 months. Administrative support? For what? George was retired. What administrative support could he possibly need that cost $30,000 a year? And why pay for it through a secret account, hidden from his wife of nearly 50 years? By noon, the initial shock had begun to coalesce into a cold, hard knot of anger and a desperate need for answers. I found the number in my old address book and dialed. Harvey Rothman, a semi-retired lawyer, a friend of a friend, sharp as a tack despite his age. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, not since George and I had our simple wills notarized in his dusty, reassuringly old-fashioned office. "Harvey, it's Claire Abbott," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "George's widow." "Ah, Claire." His voice softened instantly with genuine sympathy. "My dear, I was so sorry to hear about George. A fine man. What can I do for you?" "Harvey," I said, taking a deep breath, I think something very strange is going on with George's finances, something he kept hidden." He sighed, a weary sound I recognized from our long-ago discussions about estate planning complexities. "Claire," he said gently, "that doesn't surprise me any more than it saddens me. Tell me what you found." I told him everything: the depleted joint account, the hidden investment account with its staggering balance, the mysterious proxy, Valerie L. Scott, the cryptic withdrawals to VLS services. The money siphoned off over 12 years. "Do you have any of the documents?" he asked, his voice sharpening with professional interest. "Yes. Some statements. Receipts made out to Valerie Scott Consulting, and the bank confirmed the account exists and that she had full access." "All right," he said decisively. "Bring everything you have to my office this afternoon if you can. We need to get to the bottom of this immediately." Harvey lived in a small, book-filled cottage just outside the city limits, books stacked precariously on every available surface, spilling onto the floor. He didn't look particularly surprised when I showed him the name Valerie L. Scott printed on the receipts and bank statements. "Scott. Valerie Scott," he murmured slowly, peering at the documents through his reading glasses. "Yes. The name has come up before, a few times over the years." My heart leaped. "In what context?" "Consulting," he said vaguely, still reading. "Estate planning assistance. Financial redirection strategies. Services offered primarily to affluent older gentlemen." His meaning was delicately phrased but perfectly clear. "Financial redirection? What exactly does that mean?" He looked up then, removing his glasses, his expression kind but direct. "Claire, it often means helping clients structure their assets in ways that might shield funds from spouses, avoid probate, or perhaps even benefit third parties outside the immediate family." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Based on what you've shown me here, the secret account, the proxy status, the consulting fees, it seems highly likely that your husband may have been systematically transferring marital assets, possibly substantial ones, perhaps even directly to this woman, or into structures she controlled." I sat there in his old, comfortable leather armchair, the scent of pipe tobacco and old paper filling the air, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. Could he have done that? Legally? Without telling me? Without my signature? Possibly, Harvey admitted grimly. Depending on how the initial assets were held, if certain investments were solely in his name, if he established trusts without your knowledge, if he granted her a valid power of attorney, yes, it's possible. Even within a marriage, especially a long one where trust is implicit, financial secrecy can occur. He saw the look on my face and added gently, but legal doesn't always mean right, Claire. Especially not morally or ethically, and we may have grounds to challenge it, depending on the specifics. Harvey made a few phone calls then, his voice low and professional. One to the county records office, checking property databases. Another to a private investigator he still worked with occasionally. Just a discreet background check, Tom. Nothing intrusive yet. Then he turned back to me, his expression grave. Claire, he said, leaning forward slightly, I need you to be prepared. This Valerie Scott, she's not just some random consultant. She appears to specialize in cultivating relationships with wealthy, older men. There are whispers, unconfirmed of course, but persistent, about her involvement in several contentious estate disputes in the past, always emerging with a significant, often unexpected, portion of the assets. He paused. We need to find out exactly who she was to George and what promises or threats might have been made. He looked me directly in the eye. Do you trust me to handle this? I nodded numbly. Yes, Harvey. Completely. Then go home, he said kindly but firmly. Try to get some rest. Let me do some digging. I'll find out exactly what Valerie L. Scott is, who she is to your late husband, and where your money went. Back home, the familiar silence felt different now, charged with suspicion, poisoned by betrayal. I stood in the living room and looked numbly at the photographs lining the mantelpiece. George in his Navy uniform, young and impossibly handsome. Our wedding day, 47 years ago, both of us beaming with naive optimism. The kids when they were small, sticky-fingered, and gap-toothed. A gallery of a shared life, a life I now realized I had only seen half of. I picked up a frame containing a photo of George and me on our 25th anniversary cruise. Tanned, relaxed, holding hands on the deck, the endless ocean stretching out behind us. He looked so solid then, so dependable, so utterly real. I stared intently into the glass, searching his smiling eyes for some flicker, some hint of the deception he was already practicing, the secret life he was already building. A flicker of guilt? A shadow of deceit? A reflection of a stranger I didn't know? There was nothing. Just the familiar, loving gaze I had trusted for nearly 5 decades. That was the most chilling part. The mask had been perfect. That night, I didn't sleep again. Sleep felt impossible, irrelevant. I lay rigidly in our bed. My bed now solely mine, the fireproof safe containing the damning evidence open on the nightstand beside me. I stared numbly at the pages, the endless columns of deposits, the cryptic withdrawals, the name Valerie Scott scrolling over and over like a cruel mantra. Who was she? How had she insinuated herself into his life, into our finances, so completely, so invisibly? In the gray light of morning, the phone rang, jarring me from my troubled thoughts. It was Harvey. His voice was grim, devoid of its usual gentle reassurance. Claire, he said without preamble, she's real. Valerie L. Scott. And she's not just some accountant or secretary George hired. He paused, and I braced myself. She's listed as the sole beneficiary on a very substantial life insurance policy George took out recently, dated just 2 years ago, after his initial heart diagnosis. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the room swim sickeningly. What? Another one? How much? $2 million, Claire. $2 million. On top of the hidden account, the house, the trust, my mind couldn't grasp it. But why? Who is she to him? Was she his mistress? There was another long, heavy pause on the line. Harvey cleared his throat. Claire, according to the background check, and confirmed by some discreet inquiries, Valerie Scott wasn't his mistress. She was, well, it appears she was effectively his other household, his second family, for the past 15 years. Self-correction. Story expanded well past 4,000 words. Emotional depth increased significantly. Plot points adhered to, details changed. Now need to write the final concluding paragraphs focusing on Claire's reaction, the legal battle, if any, and the humanistic lesson learned, ensuring it replaces the original YouTube outro. I didn't cry when Harvey delivered the final, devastating blow. I didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't throw the phone against the wall. A strange, glacial calm descended over me, freezing the turbulent emotions in their tracks. I just sat there in my familiar kitchen, still clad in my nightgown, the untouched teacup from yesterday, sitting accusingly on the counter, and said, my voice eerily flat, 15 years? A second family? Does she have children? His children? Harvey cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, Claire. 2. A boy, aged 14, and a girl, aged 12. According to the documents we've uncovered, birth certificates listing George as the father, school enrollment forms, medical records, he was actively involved in their lives. Supported them financially, attended school events, took them on vacations. He maintained a separate residence for them, the house in Camden County you mentioned. 15 years. While I was raising our children, managing our home, believing in the sanctity of our vows, he was living a parallel life, fathering other children, building another family, funded by money I never knew we possessed. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was existential. It wasn't just a secret account, it was a secret life. All right, I said, the calmness in my voice frightening even myself. What now, Harvey? What are our options? Legally, Harvey explained. It's complex. The life insurance policy, naming her as beneficiary, will be difficult to contest unless we can prove undue influence or incapacity when he signed it 2 years ago. The trust fund might be challengeable depending on its specific structure and funding sources if marital assets were used without your consent. The house transferred 6 years ago. That's also potentially contestable under marital property laws, but it will be an uphill battle. He paused. Claire, this could become a very long, very public, and very painful legal fight. Are you prepared for that? I thought of George's smiling face in the photographs, the decades of shared history, the quiet comfort I had mistaken for enduring love. I thought of the lies, the secrecy, the staggering depth of his deception. I thought of Valerie Scott, not as a predatory homewrecker, but perhaps as another woman deceived, trapped in her own version of his carefully constructed narrative. I thought of the children, his other children, my late husband's children, innocent victims in this devastating saga. And I thought of myself, of the 47 years I had invested in a partnership that turned out to be a performance, of the trust I had given so freely, so blindly, of the future I had envisioned, a quiet retirement, traveling, enjoying our grandchildren, now irrevocably shattered. No, Harvey, I said finally, the decision forming with surprising clarity in the midst of the wreckage. No court battle, no public spectacle, no fighting over the remnants of a life that was built on lies. Harvey sounded surprised. But Claire, the money, the assets, it's a significant amount. It's rightfully, at least partially, yours. The money, I said, my voice barely a whisper but firm, is tainted. Every dollar represents a deception, a betrayal. I don't want it. Let her have it. Let her and those children have the financial security he apparently felt obligated to provide them, even at the cost of honesty, even at the cost of our marriage. I took a deep breath. My fight isn't about the money, Harvey. It never was. It's about the truth. And now I have it, as ugly and painful as it is. There was a long silence on the line. Then Harvey said softly, Claire, that is remarkably gracious, and perhaps, ultimately, the wisest path. In the months that followed, I navigated the practicalities of widowhood with a quiet determination. I worked with Harvey to settle George's legitimate debts using the funds from our joint accounts, the meager amount that remained, and the sale of some jointly held stocks I hadn't known existed. I filed the necessary paperwork to claim my rightful Social Security survivor benefits. I learned, step by painstaking step, how to manage my own finances, deciphering statements, paying bills online, creating a budget based on my new, much-reduced reality. Valerie Scott, through her own attorney, formally waived any claim to the house George and I had shared, the house that was legally mine. She accepted the life insurance payout and the assets held within the secret trust, settling George's hidden obligations quietly, discreetly. We never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. My children, Emily and Ben, reacted to the revelations with a mixture of shock, anger, and a confusing grief for the father they thought they knew. Emily, practical and distant, expressed sympathy but offered little tangible support. Ben, more emotional, struggled visibly with the betrayal, oscillating between fury at his father and a painful, awkward protectiveness towards me. Our relationships became strained, altered by the uncomfortable truths that now lay exposed between us. Healing, I knew, would take time, perhaps more time than I had left. But amidst the sadness, the loss, and the lingering sting of betrayal, something unexpected began to emerge, a sense of quiet liberation. I was no longer living under the shadow of George's protection, his control, his secrets. My life, however diminished financially, was finally, unequivocally, my own. I started volunteering at the local library again, finding solace in the familiar scent of old paper and the quiet company of books. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during the long years of George's subtle, isolating dominance. I even took a pottery class at the community center, discovering a surprising joy in shaping something tangible, something real, with my own hands. One crisp autumn evening, almost a year after George's death, I found myself sitting on my back porch, wrapped in an old quilt, sipping tea and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The house felt quiet, yes, but no longer empty. It felt peaceful, filled not with the ghosts of a deceptive past, but with the nascent possibilities of an authentic future. George's betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had, in a strange and painful way, set me free. Free from the illusion of a perfect marriage. Free from the comfortable complacency of unquestioning trust. Free to discover my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to navigate the world on my own terms. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true security comes not from relying on others, however beloved, but from finding the courage to rely on oneself. And that knowledge, hard-won through tears and disillusionment, was a legacy far more valuable than any hidden fortune. I was Mary Lancaster. I was alive. And for the first time in a very long time, I was truly, completely, undeniably free.